Well, good morning. Today we celebrate the Annunciation of the Lord. It can also be called the Incarnation. This is the very beginnings of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, second person of the Trinity in the flesh, in the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We're going to do a little bit of history today, okay? So bear with me. The first thing is that we hear that Mary was betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David. Of the house of David. So that means that he was of the family of David the king. Now, David lived 1,000 years before Christ. So this is how long these blood relationships hold to for so many years. 1,000 years, and still they are part of the same family. So that was the first thing that we hear from the gospel today. But if we go to the first reading of today, we hear of someone else who also belongs to the house of David. And that's King Ahaz. King Ahaz. You perhaps have never heard about King Ahaz. And I had to research about this man so that we can have a little bit of a more background about him. Now it is to King Ahaz that Isaiah gives the sign from God that the virgin will bear a son and will call him Emmanuel. That part we are aware of, because every Christmas season we sing all kinds of songs about Emmanuel. And we know that Emmanuel is God with us, right? Okay, so that promise that there will be a child that will be called Emmanuel was given to Ahaz, the king of Judah, in the 7th century before Christ. So once again, these blood relationships go for centuries. So Ahaz is the king of Judah between 736 before Christ until 716, something like that. So he was the king in Jerusalem. So let's do a little bit of history. So Judah is in the south, Jerusalem is the capital. Israel is in the north. Samaria is part of Israel. Nazareth, Galilee, all those places are part of Israel in the north. Then farther north from Israel, you have Damascus. We kind of know about Damascus because St. Paul one day was on his way to Damascus and Jesus resurrected appeared to him and his conversion took place. So you have Judah in the south, Israel in the north, Damascus even further north. And even more north, you have Assyria. And Assyria would be today's Iraq. And the kingdom of Assyria was the most powerful nation at the time. We are 700 years before Christ. Now, the kingdom of Israel and Damascus, they were making alliances because they wanted to fight the force of Assyria. And in the south, Ahaz in Judah, in Jerusalem, he is also tempted to do this military and political alliance. And that's when Isaiah comes to Ahaz, Isaiah the prophet, comes to Ahaz the king and tells him, don't do it. What does Ahaz do? Runs to the arms of the Assyrians. It's like a typical toxic relationship. You know this is going absolutely nowhere, but Ahaz runs to the arms of Assyria. And actually, when Isaiah is telling Ahaz, don't do it, instead ask for a sign from God, Ahaz looks very pious because he says, no, I don't want to tempt my God. He pretends that he doesn't want to tempt God, but he runs to the arms of the abuser, Assyria. Long story short, Assyria doesn't hold to their word. Assyria invades Damascus. Assyria invades Israel, and they are at the door because they want to invade Judah as well. So the alliance didn't go anywhere. So from that moment forward, Ahaz had to start paying money so that the Assyrians would not invade them. And just kind of keep that relationship civil and just stay that way, and we'll give you our taxes so that way you don't bother us. But there is this political alliance. And in turn, Ahaz is one of the kings of Judah that was least respected in the books of the Bible. But it is to Ahaz that comes this promise of the Emmanuel, which is interesting. Now, who was Isaiah talking about? Who is this Emmanuel? If we go back to the time of Ahaz, many people would think that would be Ahaz's son, who was another king, Hezekiah. But of course, for us Christians, this Emmanuel is somebody that came 700 years later, Jesus. But at the time, when Ahaz was king, he was replaced eventually by his son, Hezekiah, who did a lot of good things for the Holy Land and especially for Jerusalem. The son of Ahaz, Hezekiah, was highly regarded as one of the best kings of Judah. And Hezekiah did many projects in the city of Jerusalem and brought some kind of peace to the nation, at least temporarily, before the Babylonians came a century later. Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, actually built a water system in the city of Jerusalem that exists even to this day. It's called Hezekiah's Tunnel, because Hezekiah wanted to bring fresh water to the city of Jerusalem to keep the inhabitants alive and well and healthy. Interesting that if Hezekiah were to be the actual Emmanuel of the story that we hear on the first reading of today, Hezekiah brings fresh water to the city. 700 years later, Jesus, the life-giving water, the source of living water, came to us. So it's an interesting parallel that we see in these two stories. So what do we learn from the story of Ahaz, who doesn't want to tempt the Lord, and then he receives this premonition that the virgin shall bear a son and will be called Emmanuel? What do we learn from this? Is that we human beings are always tempted in this vicious cycle of toxic relationships. And by toxic relationships, I don't mean just people, I mean everything. I mean politics, I mean food, alcohol, drugs, in general. What do we do as human beings? We just keep the vicious cycle. And that's what Ahaz did. Even though he was warned by the prophet, we who are warned by our gut feelings, we who are constantly being warned by the things that our heart is telling us in our mind, don't do this, we still run to the arms of the one that is going to bring us harm. It's the vicious cycle that we human beings, sinners, experience all the time. And this was so true for the people of Judah, with the Assyrians, with the Egyptians, with the Babylonians, with the Greeks, and with the Romans. The people of God kept going back to the abuser, kept going back and going back. And that's what we do, unfortunately, as human beings. We just keep going back to those things that are destructive to us. And Jesus finally came to break that cycle. When we see Jesus on the cross, what we see is God planting his tree of peace and of breaking the vicious cycle of this toxicity of our humanity. This great desire of us of running once again to what is going to destroy us. Jesus on the cross says, stop, no more of this vicious cycle. So Jesus brings us this hope that it is possible to break those cycles. It is possible to put our foot down and to say no more. Isn't that what a person who is recovering from alcoholism has to do? That's something that we all struggle, I myself personally, with food, is that we eventually have to say, stop, no more. I cannot continue in this vicious cycle. And Jesus with his cross comes to say, it is possible to break the cycle. It is possible to break the cycle. And with my dying, I'm going to break this cycle of sin and of death. So this is a great mystery that we celebrate today. Even though the Jesus' crucifixion, we're going to celebrate it next week, it really begins at the moment when God decides to become flesh in the womb of Mary. And that's what we celebrate today. Jesus is the Emmanuel. Jesus is God with us. Jesus is the one that breaks all kinds of cycles of sin and death that we run to the arms of those things that will be destructive to us. So this is good news, that Jesus has given us the hope that with God's help and God being with us, Emmanuel, God with us, we are able to break all these things and live truly in the freedom of the children of God. May the Lord bless us abundantly on this day, March 25th, the Annunciation of the Lord, in anticipation to his birth in Christmas. Amen.